Hello and welcome to this IISS Europe webinar entitled Navigating Troubled Waters, the Houthi Campaign in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. I'm Nick Childs. I'm the Senior Fellow for Naval Forces and Maritime Security at the Institute, based here in what we like to describe as our global headquarters at Arundel House in London, and I will be moderating this event today. The subject matter, of course, substantively, is the Houthi Ansarullah campaign against shipping in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, which for essentially a year now has been grabbing international attention, but also in many respects confounding the international community in terms of how to counter it. The actual title of the webinar takes its title from a major new report and an important new report that the IISS has published on this subject. And I'm very pleased to be joined by a series of colleagues, a panel of essentially the authors and key researchers for this report. Specifically, and to start off with, Wolf Christian Pace, Senior Fellow for Armed Conflict, based in our IISS Europe office in Berlin. Also Edward Beals, Research Assistant for Armed Conflict, and Fabian Hinz, Research Fellow for Defence and Military Analysis. They are all based in the IISS Europe office, but also we have Albert Vidal, Research Analyst for Defence and Military Analysis, based in the IISS Middle East office in Bahrain. The choreography for this will be that, first of all, I'll invite Wolf Christian Pace to make a few opening overture remarks to set the context of this report, and then each of the authors in turn will make substantive presentations of 6 to 8 minutes on the key areas of research that they have focused on in this paper. After that, we will move to the question and answer session, in which I will invite our members of the audience to make interventions and ask questions in one of two ways. One is in the traditional raised hand function in order to put a question directly, and we will organize that so that everyone can hear the question, or you can write an answer in the chat function, but we will deal more with the details of that part of the conversation when we get to it, and I'll go over those options once again then. For now, though, I would, without further ado, like to pass the proceedings over to Wolf Christian Pace to get us into the substantive discussion. Wolf, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nick, and a very good afternoon to those of you based in Europe. Good morning and good evening, night for those elsewhere. It's a great pleasure to present our report on the Houthi campaign against shipping in the Red Sea to all of you. The report came out in mid-December last year. I think it has aged reasonably well. And but what we're going to do is we're actually going to present you some updated data, and that's going to be the focus of, in particular, Edward's and Albert's presentation later on. So you will see that some of the data that we're showing you today goes a little bit further than what you see in the report, if you had already an opportunity to look at it. Now, before we go into that, I just want to briefly take you back to the situation approximately 14 months ago in November 2023, when the Houthis started their campaign against commercial shipping in the Red Sea in earnest. Now, keeping in mind that this is not the first time that the Houthis emerged as a maritime threat. They had been attacking ships, in particular Saudi and Emirati ships, already during the 8 years of Yemen civil war. But from a Western perspective, this was at the very best a sideshow. So, I mean, we weren't paying a lot of attention, even though occasionally also Western commercial ships were affected by this, but I think it was a mere blimp on the radar of most shipping companies. Now, all of this changed quite drastically in November. First with the attack on the Galaxy Leader, which was hijacked in a rather spectacular fashion, and then with attacks using missiles, UAVs, and other weapon systems that Fabian will be talking about a little bit later on about. And by the time, roughly a year ago, I think the new reality started to sink in that the Houthis were going to remain a problem for shipping lines, Western shipping lines as well. And, basically, there was a great degree of alarm in Western capitals. I might say there was talk about broken supply lines, goods from China no longer making it to our supermarkets, inflationary pressure, recession of the world economy, and all of that. And now, if we look back, what has actually happened during the course of the campaign, we don't see a lot of that. And Albert is going to speak a little bit about the economic impact. So in many ways, it seems like most of the world has adjusted to the new normal. Shipping lines have adjusted to the new realities, but also policymakers have probably accepted that the Houthis are going to be around for a while, but there's no easy fix. Now, having said that, there are some interesting trends, and in order to give you an overview about where we stand, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Edward.
Thank you very much, Wolf Christian. So if we could perhaps open up the PowerPoint. I am going to present a quantitative overview of the Houthi attacks on ships and the international responses. So if we could go forward 2 slides, please. Before we get going, I'd like to highlight 3 points. So firstly, in our report, Chapter 1's reporting period covered November 2023 to August 2024. Here, I've extended it to November 2024, meaning that we have the data for 1 year of attacks. Unfortunately, we don't yet have the complete data for the latest month, so December 2024. Secondly, our own quantitative analysis is based on data compiled by the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data, so ACLED. The ACLED data is regularly updated, so this should explain any differences between the earlier figures in our report and here. Basically, you're looking at the most up-to-date version right now. Thirdly, in terms of our methodology, incidents that differ by time, location, agent, or type of activity are counted as separate attacks or strikes. This is in an effort to make sense of very dynamic and complex situations. However, it does mean that the overall attack or strike count may therefore differ from the actual number of incidents. On a related note, some attempted attacks might also have been mere displays of force. So next slide, please. Figure 1 shows the number of Houthi attacks on ships. The blue line shows the total number of attempted attacks, including successful, intercepted, and missed or failed attacks, whereas the red line shows only successful attacks. Overall, there have been 308 attempted attacks, out of which 57 were successful. Both counts have fluctuated, and successful attacks remained consistently low compared to attempted attacks. 2 points to highlight are firstly the peak in attempted attacks in June 2024 with a count of 48. This coincided with the start of Israel's offensive in Rafah and the scheduled departure of the Eisenhower carrier strike group from the region, which the Houthis might have sought to exploit. And secondly, the general decline in attempted attacks from August 2024, which Christian will discuss later. So next slide, please. On slide 4, so map 1 shows the distribution of the Houthi attacks on ships. Out of the 308 attempted attacks, we have 171, so over half took place in the southern Red Sea, 70 in the Gulf of Aden, 48 in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and 3 in the western Arabian Sea. In addition, 15 attempted attacks ultimately fell or were intercepted inland. The map categorizes the 308 attacks into 3 types based on their outcomes. 151, so almost half interceptions in yellow, 101 missed or failed attacks in green, and 57 successful attacks in red. Most interceptions took place in the southern Red Sea, pointing to the concentrated defense measures of the 2 naval missions, so Operation Prosperity Guardian and Aspides in this area. In contrast, missed or failed attacks and successful attacks were more dispersed across the region. One case to highlight is the red plot in the very bottom right corner of the map. This denotes the Houthis' successful UAV attack on the MSC Orion on the 27th of April 2024, and this was the Houthis' first successful attack in the Indian Ocean. So next slide, please. Figure 2 shows the number of attacks per weapon system type used in Houthi attacks on ships. As you can see, UAVs and ballistic missiles were the most employed weapon system types, used in 119 and 99 attacks respectively. USVs followed with a count of 30. So interestingly, this weapon system type was very popular this past summer, having been used in 24 of these attacks from June to August. And just to flag that the attack counts, especially those involving the use of missiles, should be treated as baselines. This is because we have the unspecified missile and mixed categories. So next slide, please. Map 2 shows the distribution of US and UK strikes on Houthi targets in Yemen, so under Operation Poseidon Archer, which began on the 12th of January 2024. Overall, there were 266 strikes. These can be categorized into 2 types, so again, static and mobile targets. Firstly, 137 strikes on static targets were conducted by the US and to a lesser extent UK forces. More specifically, these strikes have hit Houthi stationary military assets, for example, command and control centers, production facilities, air defense systems, and radars. As you can see, these strikes have been dispersed across the central and southern governorates of Western Yemen. Secondly, 129 strikes on mobile targets were carried out by US forces. These strikes have preemptively targeted Houthi mobile weapon systems that were ready to launch in the direction of the Red Sea or Gulf of Aden, and all were considered an imminent threat to shipping. As you can see, these strikes have been more heavily concentrated along Yemen's western coastline. Here, at least 130 weapon system targets were struck, including at least 135 UAVs and 76 cruise missiles. Next slide, please. So to wrap up, relevant within our reporting period are also Israel's first 2 airstrikes on Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen in July and September 2024. The first round of strikes, dubbed Operation Outstretched Arm, hit targets in and near Hudaydah on the 20th of July, whilst the second wave of strikes hit targets in and near Hudaydah, as well as Ras Isa on the 29th of September. I've listed out the targets on the slide, and these strikes were in retaliation to successful and intercepted Houthi attacks on Israel. However, they were also seemingly aimed at disrupting the smuggling of weapons and fuel from Iran to the Houthis in Yemen, which Christian will discuss later. So thank you very much for listening, and I will now pass on to Fabian.
Well, thank you so much for this excellent overview, Edward. I'm going to talk a little about the Houthi strategic arsenal that they've been employing during the Red Sea campaign. And let's start with the Houthi takeover of most of northern Yemen itself in 2015. Next slide, please. Next slide. So the Yemeni army, like many Middle Eastern militaries, already had a focus on different missile systems, including ballistic missiles, long before the Houthis took over the capital, Sana'a. What you can see here is basically the status of the Yemeni armed forces in 2015. They had a few ballistic missiles, older, less accurate types than they have today, and a few anti-ship cruise missiles, but it was a very limited arsenal. Nevertheless, the Houthis managed to take over this arsenal. A lot of the units that operated Yemen's missiles stayed loyal to the former president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, and these units then, of course, entered into an alliance with the Houthis, but quickly became absorbed by the Houthi war machine itself. So this is what they started with. And if you go to the next slide, you're going to see the development that this arsenal has seen over the last few years. So you see very substantial increases in range, but at the same time, you see entirely new categories of weapon systems that have been added to the arsenal. These include precision-guided ballistic missiles, land attack cruise missiles, one-way attack UAVs or suicide drones, whatever you want to call them, as well as a substantial number of anti-ship systems. Next slide, please. And this is what really struck us when in 2022, the Houthis conducted their first large military parades after the ceasefire with the Saudi-led coalition. So for a long time, we knew that the Houthis had received additional naval systems. We had seen them, as Wolf Christian has pointed out, being used in combat a number of times, but still on a limited scale. And in 2022, when they started parading all of their weaponry out in the open, we could see that they had amassed a very substantial and very diverse, surprisingly diverse arsenal of naval weaponry. So from 2022 onwards, we could see that projecting power in the Red Sea and beyond was a key focus of their activities, and that they had established a quite diverse arsenal using Iranian help to do so. Now, what does this arsenal consist of? As Edward has already pointed out, there are different systems that have been used on a different scale. Let's start with the anti-ship ballistic missiles. These themselves are quite interesting because until a few years ago, this was considered a very unique and niche and very advanced capability that very few actors around the world had. So discussions about anti-ship ballistic missiles usually focused around China and the so-called carrier killers. We knew, of course, that Iran had developed a few systems using imaging infrared seekers that in the terminal phase could recognize ship silhouettes on the sea and hit those. But they hadn't been a major focus. Now, with the Houthis, we have seen both a version of the Iranian Fateh 110 equipped for anti-ship missions that the Houthis call IISS, but we've also seen a number of other systems, shorter range systems that they've paraded, and we've heard from Western militaries that apparently different types of missiles are being used. What these exact types are is often difficult to ascertain because they always get destroyed, whether they hit, whether they miss, whether they get shot down, they will always get destroyed. Western militaries cannot really examine them, so it's difficult to know. We know that the Fateh 110 has been used, an Iranian-supplied missile, but it's also quite possible that they have used shorter range systems that might combine Yemeni production with Iranian guidance kits. So a model similar to what Hezbollah has been attempting or used to attempt in Lebanon, local production, Iranian guidance kits. And it's also possible that they've used converted surface-to-air missiles that were still from the old Yemeni army stockpile, which they then converted into anti-ship ballistic missiles. Anti-ship cruise missiles here, the situation is much clearer. They have a number of Iranian-supplied systems. The interesting thing here when it comes to anti-ship cruise missiles is less the systems themselves, but the fact that they've been used so little, as Edward has been pointed out. There's a number of potential explanations for this. The first is that these systems cannot be produced inside Yemen. They might be assembled inside Yemen, but they cannot be produced. So in terms of logistics, it's difficult to get a large number to Yemen compared to, let's say, other systems like UAVs that can be locally produced. Another explanation is that these systems are not that advanced, so probably they have to be fired from the shoreline, and the Houthis only control a limited area around the shore, which is under heavy surveillance by the US. So it would be quite dangerous to fire these missiles without being detected first. And if you see CENTCOM statements, they're actually talking about taking out a large number of anti-ship cruise missile launchers. So that might be another explanation. The most numerous weapon of all that that we're seeing being used against ships is one-way attack UAVs. So basically, the Iranians have designed a high-end system for longer ranges, which is the Shahed, that's being used inside Ukraine a lot, and a lower-end system that is much simpler, much cheaper, and much easier to locally produce in a country with limited opportunities like Yemen. That is the so-called Samad 3. That system can be used as a long-range one-way attack UAV to attack static targets on land, has been used in that capability by the Houthis against Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. But there's also a loitering version that has a camera in its nose, a direct radio link, probably around 100 to 150 kilometers of communications range. And that is the system that has been used the most against ships by the Houthis. How exactly they do the long over-the-horizon attacks, beyond that limited communications range. That is still a bit of a mystery. Are they having airborne relays on ships? We don't know. We know that sometimes they use them in a very primitive, fully autonomous mode, which has been called the flying minefield, where you just have them crisscrossing a certain path and waiting for a ship to pass, which of course is very inefficient, but we know they've used them that way. The big advantage here, of course, is they're cheap, they're simple, they're easy to produce inside Yemen. And a lot of the components are commercial off the shelf, so they can directly source them from, let's say, Chinese companies, Asian companies, without these components even having to pass Iran itself. Finally, there are USVs, one-way attack drone boats that have been used, as Edward has pointed out, increasingly over the summer of 2024. Here you have a number of different systems, some custom built, some converted fishing skiffs. The big advantage of these systems from a Houthi point of view is that they can pack pretty high punches. So UAVs have a payload of, let's say, 10, 15, 20 kilograms. These drone boats can pack up to 1,000 kilograms of explosives. They explode close to the waterline of a vessel, so the chances of actually sinking a ship with that type of system is much higher than with, let's say, a UAV or even an anti-ship cruise missile. And here again, we're probably seeing a mixture of Iranian design, Iranian components, and local Yemeni production. Again, it's possible to defend against these systems, but what is difficult for Western navies is just the huge variety of systems. And what is also quite challenging in this regard is the anti-ship ballistic missile systems, because that is a type of weapon that the US comes prepared to defend against, but for many European navies that don't have specialized ballistic missile defense capabilities yet, it's quite a new challenge that has proven quite a challenge during the campaign in the Red Sea. So that's my short overview of the systems used by the Houthis. I'm happy to hand over to Albert Vidal, and if you have any questions later on, feel free to ask.
Thank you, Fabian. If you can please move to the next slide. Thank you. So yeah, I'll talk about the economic impact of the shipping disruption, the disruption in both shipping and ports in the region. Now, the main takeaway of the research that I've done is that globally, the impact has been milder than expected, as Wolf alluded to in the introduction, with no significant rises in consumer costs and inflation as of late 2024. But the declines in port calls and the loss of Suez Canal revenues have had a significant impact on Red Sea littoral countries, many of which were already quite fragile. Next slide, please. Now let's look at the data a bit more closely. So the number of transits through the Suez Canal and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait has declined by around 60%. If we take the deadweight tonnage sum instead, the decline is even bigger at 70%. That's roughly from around 500 to 200 ships per week. Next slide, please. You can see that there's not much difference between the declines in the Bab el-Mandeb and the Suez Canal, but not all traffic has been equally affected. So, for example, vehicle carriers, liquefied petroleum gas carriers, and LNG carriers have almost entirely stopped transiting the Red Sea, whereas container ships, dry bulk carriers, and product tankers have been impacted, but not to the same degree. Next slide, please. Now, rerouting through the Cape of Good Hope around Africa adds at least 30% more time and around $1 million in additional fuel costs. This figure shows that the impact of diversions is also extremely dependent on the ports of origin and destination. So the closer both ports are to the Red Sea on either side, the more costly the diversion becomes. For example, trips from Jebel Ali to Port Said in Egypt became 3 times longer than before the crisis started. But when both ports are located far away from the Red Sea, the impacts of the diversion decline. So for instance, a trip from Shanghai to Rotterdam would only see a 30% increase in duration. Now, going around Africa is, of course, more expensive, but the cost difference is also not that big as one may expect, because vessels avoiding the Red Sea are not paying Suez Canal transit fees, which range between $400,000 to $700,000 US pre-crisis, in addition to, of course, now saving on insurance premiums. So overall, the crisis has had a marginal impact on global supply chains and inflationary pressure. And there are several factors that have made these delays more manageable. The first one might be that the greater container shipping capacity allowed shipping companies to adjust. And this was helped by a moderate consumer demand, sufficient inventories, the continued stability of energy markets, and the fact that, unlike happened with the Ever Given, this is just a partial obstruction. It's not a complete obstruction of the Red Sea. Now, what's a bit more concerning is the increase in freight rates in the affected routes, which has been driven primarily by a rise in the war risk premiums, especially for the ships linked to Israel, to the UK, and to the US. Interestingly, ships tied to both Russia and China are paying lower insurance premiums, which is likely due to a lower risk profile. Next slide, please. Now, most Red Sea ports have seen a decline in trade activity since the beginning of the crisis. This figure shows an index, the Port Liner Shipping Connectivity Index, that reflects the degree of integration of selected Red Sea ports into global liner shipping networks. What we wanted to transmit with this figure is the changes between Q4 2023, which is before the disruption, Q1 2024, which is immediately after the disruption began, and then we chose Q3 to reflect the most recent data at the time of writing. You can see that, for instance, in Egypt, there are several ports, such as Port Said, Sokhna, which are seeing fewer containers transiting through the facilities. However, in the case of Egypt, the main concern has been the loss of over $7 billion in Suez Canal revenues, which amounts to over 60% of its expected 2024 revenues. In Israel, the smaller port of Eilat, which is not in the figure, has completely stopped activity since January 2024. Now, the port accounts only for 5% of Israeli trade, but the halt in activity has led to many layoffs in the port, and the city's economy appears to be bleeding as well. The ports of Haifa and Ashdod in the Eastern Mediterranean have also been heavily impacted by the crisis, as you can see in the graph. In Jordan, Aqaba, which is the only port, has also suffered from the disruption. Throughput fell nearly half in the first few months, with potash exports, which are Jordan's main export, being particularly affected. Next slide, please. In Saudi Arabia, well, first, in this graph, you can see both the port calls and imports and export volumes. Now, the most dramatic decrease that we've seen in the Red Sea is Saudi Arabia's King Abdullah port. There was a decline in about 88% in container handling throughout the first semester of last year. The port of Jeddah, which is much, much larger than King Abdullah, has seen lesser decline, but still significant. In Sudan, Port Sudan, which is the country's main port, had already had a decline after the 2023 outbreak of the civil war, but the Houthi-caused disruption has led to further declines in traffic through the port. This has forced humanitarian agencies to find alternative routes to deliver aid to Sudan. And this, of course, is resulting in greater costs and significant delays compared to pre-crisis levels. The case of Djibouti is interesting. There are reports saying that it has somewhat benefited from the crisis. The reason is that many of the larger container vessels that would previously go through the Red Sea are now dropping off their cargo in Djibouti. And the country is benefiting from storage fees and also from the activity of many smaller feeder companies and vessels that are redistributing those container ships into other Red Sea ports. And in Yemen, the Houthi-controlled ports of Hodeidah, Salif, and Ras Isa saw increased traffic in both fuel and food imports during the first half of the year. But since Israel began its attacks on port infrastructure and most recently tugboats, the traffic in Yemeni ports has declined. And now there's a recent report from this month in Bloomberg explaining that there is a big backlog of oil tankers near Ras Isa, probably a result of the 3 recent attacks in December and January. Now, beyond the Red Sea, the impact of the crisis has been mixed. There has been port congestion in ports across the world, especially the first few months of the crisis. But in the interest of time, I'd be happy to answer questions during the Q&A. Over to you, Wolf.
Thank you, Albert. Thank you for highlighting the economic impact on the crisis. Next slide, please. Before we come to the conclusion of our report, and then of course invite questions from the audience, we wanted to quickly highlight the issue of arms smuggling, right? As you've heard from the previous speakers, what has really surprised, I think, most analysts at the beginning of the crisis in November 2023 was the number and sophistication of weapon systems employed by the Houthis. Like we said before, this is not the first time that they are attacking shipping. What is new is really scale and precision. Just to give you a figure, I tried to count the number of attacks of Houthis against commercial ships between 2018 and 2022. So basically the time of the ceasefire between the Houthis and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And the number I got to was about 20. And as we've heard from Edward earlier on, we stand at 308 for basically a 12-month period in this current campaign. So the question is, how are they doing it? I mean, Fabian has already explained a little bit the kind of technology being employed and hinted at the Iranian origin of a lot of the weapon systems, both in terms of technical knowledge, but also in terms of parts. And I'd like to show you the main trafficking routes that we're aware of, and then discuss what action is being taken to stop the smuggling. Next slide, please. And this map also in our report. Basically, we know that Iran has been supplying weapons to the Houthis since before the Arab Spring Revolution in Sana'a. So for those of you who've not been following Yemen closely, prior to this crisis, the Houthis had been fighting an internal battle against the previous government already for a period of 10 years, the so-called Sada Wars, mostly focused on the mountainous northern region of Yemen. And even at that time, there was some indication that some weapon shipments from Iran made it to them. We know very little about the scale. There isn't a lot of information, but even back then, the focus was very much on the maritime domain, and in particular on dhows. Dhows, as most of you will know, are wooden cargo ships, traditional cargo ships that are very common in the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean, ranging in size from small fishing boats, 10 meters, 11 meters, to fairly large ships with the size of 50, even 60 meters. So that's the scope. Dhow, by the way, is a Western name. So in Arabia, the different types of ships have, of course, their own names. But for the reason of simplicity, we stay with dhows here. So what do we know? In 2015, when the civil war in Yemen escalated after the Houthis took Sana'a, and then the Saudi-led military coalition started air operations, maritime operations, later ground operations against the Houthis. Most of Yemen was subject to an effective military blockade. This is particularly true for the land border with Saudi Arabia, but of course also for the airports. So I mean, no flights were going to Yemeni airports past March 2015. No civilian flights or non-coalition flights. And it was also true for the maritime domain, where Saudi Arabia and its allies quickly established a naval coalition that imposed what a lot of observers called a blockade of the 3 main ports under Houthi control, being Hodeidah and Salif and Ras Isa. How do they still then manage to smuggle weapons? We're aware of sort of three major maritime routes. You can see them on this map. One of them basically, they all originate in Iran, places like Bandar Abbas, Bandar IISS, and other smaller ports on the Gulf of Oman coast. And then one route basically follows the Omani coastline. There have been a few cases where we were able to document transshipment, that is basically moving cargo from one dhow to another dhow, typically from a larger dhow to smaller dhows that are easier disguised as fishing vessels. That used to happen, for example, near the Kuria Muria Islands, which are part of Oman, offshore, of course, not in the ports. And then the dhows were going towards southern Yemen, in particular the Al-Mahra governorate and the Hadar. And from there, of course, the weapons were then smuggled overland through the desert towards the Houthis. The second, probably best documented route is via Somalia, northern Somalia, in particular Puntland and Somaliland. Again, basically a big dhow would go to Somali territorial waters, sometimes also to ports like Bosaso, and then you would have transshipment there to smaller fishing vessels, which go across the Gulf of Aden to Hadramaut and Al-Mahra. Third dhow smuggling route that we're aware of went via Djibouti, the port of Obok. That route has been particularly prominent in smuggling of chemicals, because, of course, in addition to components for missiles and other weapon systems, you also need to smuggle the chemicals to manufacture the missile fuel. And from Obok then to Udeida and Salif. These shipments were disguised as fertilizer, urea fertilizer more specifically. And even though people had suspected for a long time that fertilizer, chemicals called, labeled as fertilizer, were being smuggled to the controlled areas. Until 2021, there wasn't a lot of enforcement. Basically, people thought, fertilizer doesn't matter. They don't use it to manufacture explosives. And there wasn't a lot of embargo enforcement. Now, what happened then? In 2022, the ceasefire between the Saudis and the Houthis happened around Ramadan time. The ceasefire has been in place informally ever since. So, I mean, the degree of violence inside of Yemen has gone down quite significantly in the last 2 years. And part of the ceasefire agreement, it appears to be, was the lifting of the quote-unquote blockade on the two ports, Udeida and Salif, and then Ras Isa. Previously, as I said, coalition warships would ensure that only ships that had been cleared by something called the UNVIM, the United Nations Verification Mechanism, would be allowed to proceed to Udeida, Salif, and Ras Isa. UNVIM conducts inspections in Djibouti, so basically ships had to go to Djibouti, wait for the inspection. Then they would go to an area called the coalition holding area off the coast of Yemen, waiting for permission by the Saudi alliance to proceed to the ports. That, of course, added a lot of cost and time to shipments. And as a result of that, it was deeply unpopular, both with the Houthis, obviously, but also with a lot of Yemenis, because the cost of goods, of course, was higher than it would have been otherwise. We don't quite know at what stage the Saudi naval presence was reduced, but clearly at some stage between 2022 and late 2023, that happened. And the reason we know that is that in October 2023, it came to our attention for the first time that big ships, not dhows, but steel ships, right, modern ships, were going directly from Bandar Abbas to Udeida and Salif. We've been able to document 5 or 6 different ships who've been making these return journeys. And as you can imagine, if you're able to bring a big ship to these ports, the ability to smuggle more sophisticated weapons in much larger quantities is quite different from what you can move on a dhow. It's hard to move ballistic missiles on a dhow for any number of reasons. So basically, we still have a UN sanctions regime in place vis-a-vis the Houthis. But what has been lacking, at least since 2022, has been the enforcement mechanism, more so than before. We also have a certain degree of overland smuggling coming from Oman. Coming from elsewhere, but going via Oman. This is particularly prominent for so-called dual-use items. Dual-use items are components that are civilian in nature but have military applications. In the case of the Houthis, we're talking about engines, and particularly for UAVs, for these suicide and reconnaissance drones that Fabian was speaking about. Most of these engines are manufactured in China these days, some also in Europe, including in Germany, and they are coming almost exclusively via Oman. Other parts are electronics, obviously, for guidance, communication, and whatnot. Propeller blades and servo actuators. Servo actuators are basically small engines being used to move the control surfaces, in particular of UAVs, missiles, and USVs, drone boats. So we've been able to document quite a number of shipments going via Oman and originating primarily in China. There isn't necessarily a direct Iranian link. Do we know about production capabilities of the Houthis? Fabian has already spoken at some lengths about it. I mean, it's widely accepted that the Samad family of UAVs is manufactured indeed in Yemen. So, I mean, yes, components are being imported, but not even, with some exceptions, not even from Iran, but directly from manufacturers in Asia and in other countries. Certain types of guided rockets might be manufactured in Yemen as well. And there are lots of question marks about whether or not there is an indigenous ballistic missile capability that goes beyond, let's say, the 100 or 150 kilometer range. And what we can say with some certainty is that the Houthis certainly do not manufacture cruise missiles. Now, if you keep in mind what Everett has shown you earlier on about the weapon systems, it's quite telling how over time the deployment of weapon shifted. The Houthis started with a lot of missiles, including cruise missiles, in the early stages of the conflict, and then moved towards more UAVs and USVs, both of which are manufactured in Yemen, while maintaining the ballistic missile pressure. So that is certainly partially a function of supply. What is very interesting about the smuggling, and that's the last point I'm going to make before moving to our conclusions, is that there hasn't been a lot of seizures of smuggled weapons recently. In fact, since the beginning of the Houthi campaign, 2 seizures were announced by the US Navy, one on the 11th of January 2024 and one on the 28th of January 2024. These were the only 2 seizures publicly announced during the time period. That is quite interesting because, well, given how many attacks the Houthis carried out, you would assume that the smuggling network must be very busy. We're aware of some smaller scale seizures by Yemeni forces, non-Houthi Yemeni forces operating out of Mocha in recent months, but it's entirely possible that there were other more important seizures that have just not been documented or publicly announced, including by the United States of America. Now, coming to the end of our presentation, and of course inviting all of you to ask questions, the question is, where do we go from here? So basically moving away from smuggling and moving to the conclusions. Next slide, please. I'm not sure we have a new next slide. There we are. So that was our final one. So I think the interesting question is, where do we go from here in terms of the region? We've been talking to a lot of sort of shipping companies over the last couple of months, and what is fairly clear is that most of the companies have adjusted to what we would call the new normal. So basically, it's unlikely that those container lines and tanker lines who are no longer going through the Red Sea will be coming back anytime soon, unless there's complete cessation of hostilities, right? So the fact that the kinetic intensity has gone down quite significantly, and since late summer last year, doesn't seem to have reassured shipping that they could go back to the Red Sea. So basically for them, it doesn't make a difference whether 10 missiles are in the air per day, or you have a single missile every 2 weeks. The risk alone is enough to avoid those waters. And even if there were a complete cessation of hostilities, we probably would also still be looking at a 6 months period before some of the traffic would return, just because of scheduling issues and port contracts and the like. So, you know, if all of this stops tomorrow, it would probably be the summer before we would see a surge in traffic. At the same time, some shipping lines obviously continue to operate, and Albert has given a very good overview. More detail is in the report of who continues to operate, and basically they've also adjusted to the new normal, and they're just basically being willing to take a greater deal of risk than the other companies. In terms of the international response, what is fairly clear is that so far it has not been sufficient to stop the Houthis from carrying out these attacks, which of course was a stated goal. Yes, Houthi capability to attack are severely degraded, and that certainly explains the dip in attacks since the late summer, but not to the extent that they would not be able to launch missiles anymore. And I think the biggest challenge we really have is that even if tomorrow we would see a cessation of hostilities, our concern at IISS is that the Houthis would remain a potential threat actor, and it would just be a matter of time before we see a return either to attacks in the Red Sea on ships, or even attacks on neighboring countries, as we saw between 2017 and 2022. So the big question is, you know, how do we contain the Houthis as a potential threat to the region in whatever political solution is being looked for Yemen? Because what is also very clear is there is no obvious military solution to this problem. And with that, I'd like to hand back to Nick Charles and the audience for questions.
Thanks very much, Wolf Christian, and thanks to all my colleagues and all the authors for what has been a very informative, and particularly in the finest traditions of the IISS, a data-rich and heavily fact-supported analysis. As you said, Wolf Christian, it's time now to turn to the question and answer session, the discussion session. And as I mentioned previously, you have two options to pose a question. You can use the raised hand function, with which you can put a question directly. We will facilitate you. I will call on you and ask you specifically to identify yourself and any association you have. But there is also the chat function, and there are already a number of questions in the chat room. So I'm going to go straight to those to begin with, and I'll group together two or three, which will then invite various colleagues to respond to. One of the first questions is from Timothy Dowse. He asked a number of questions about blockading and weapons supplies from the Houthis, which, Wolf Christian, I think you've answered to some extent, to a significant degree. But he also asks specifically, and this may be a question for Fabian to add his gloss and insights, is what idea we have, do we have any idea on what the actual stockpiles of weaponry that the Houthis hold have been? From George Grech in Malta, another question on, sanctions and potential sanctions enforcement. He makes reference to the Al-Shabaab sanctions, UN Al-Shabaab sanctions renewal, which is due in February, and he asks, is there any latitude or possibility of the UN Security Council authorizing inspections, seizures and disposals to be carried out by Operation Atalanta and Aspides, the EU missions in the region, within the Al-Shabaab sanctions regime, given that there are, he says, reports that the Houthis are providing arms and related materiel to Al-Shabaab. and then a couple of questions, one from Ketil Volden, but also one from Mohammed Al-Basha, both making reference, I think, or at least motivated by the renewed speculation that a Gaza ceasefire, in some respects, may be closer at hand again, and they both, in different ways, asks essentially the question of would a Gaza ceasefire now likely make the Houthis either end or reduce their attacks against shipping. So I'm going to ask Fabian initially on stockpiles, Wolf Christian maybe on the Security Council resolutions, and UN backing for a more interventionist role for the EU. Whether the EU would welcome that or not, I don't know. And perhaps both. Maybe Wolf Christian also kicking off, and others may have thoughts on this issue of will the ceasefire calm the waters of the Red Sea. So Fabian, first over to you.
Well, dependency on Iran and stockpile numbers, these are very interesting questions. When it comes to dependency on foreign supplies, I would say it really depends on the systems we're talking about. So if you look at the systems they've been using in terms of cruise missiles and ballistic missiles to strike Israel, those are 100% dependent on Iran. If there was no more Iranian support, they could not strike Israel with ballistic missiles. I think that's pretty certain. They could not strike it with cruise missiles either. With UAVs, it really depends on the class of UAVs. The UAVs that are shorter range, like the ones that are used in the Red Sea primarily, they could probably produce them without any dependence on Iran, using their own supply networks to some extent, or if they can't 100%, they could learn how to do it. And then, of course, there's the question of the continuous development. I mean, we must not forget that Yemen is still a very poor country and a very underdeveloped country. If you want to remain competitive in an offense-defense development dynamic, you need some sort of development infrastructure. And whether Yemen could support this on its own, I have some doubts. One also should always keep in mind that with these local production structures of proxies, it's not that these proxies are developing them on their own to become more dependent of Iran. It's Iranian strategy to enable them. They've been very clear about that. And they specifically design systems that are simple enough to produce by these proxies that are then tested and designed in Tehran, or designed in Iran, tested in Iran, but transferred. So I think there's still quite a bit of dependency, even if it is decreasing in some aspects like UAVs. Stockpile numbers are very difficult to come by, even for Iranian systems where we know where the factories are. It's difficult to get a clear estimate. I think when you look at the UAVs in particular, because they are so simple and they're so cheap, the ones the Houthis use probably cost less than $10,000 per piece. The components are widely available. We know that the Iranians delivered thousands of the much more complex Shahed 136 to Russia. So I think we would talk about hundreds or thousands and easy production. With anti-ship ballistic missiles, again, it's much less clear because we don't know to what extent they're converting old stuff, they're importing stuff, and to what extent they're producing stuff. So not a very satisfactory answer, but just very difficult to estimate.
Yeah, maybe trying to address the Gaza question first. I mean, he didn't really put much of an emphasis on this today, but of course the reason the Houthis initiated this campaign was in solidarity with what they would call the Palestinian resistance in Gaza in particular. And they have said multiple times that for them, a ceasefire that is agreeable to the Palestinian resistance would be like the precondition to stop their military campaign. Now, are we really, is such a breakthrough just on the horizon? We shall see. Indeed, it seems there's renewed diplomatic push. Would such a ceasefire necessarily lead to a calming of the troubled waters of the Red Sea? I think there is a good chance it would. However, this would depend on the one hand on Israel, which on occasion has announced that it will go after the Houthis quite independently of the Gaza situation. I mean, the Netanyahu government has made some very sort of aggressive statements, particularly in late December. So that remains to be seen whether that would really quieten things down. And then there is the bigger issue, that on the one hand, the Houthis are actually quite significantly benefiting from this conflict, right? The Houthis feed off war, right? War is good for them. The war against the Saudi coalition was good for them, and this war is even better for them. I mean, finally, they can live up to the slogan, which famously, of course, declares "Death to America, death to the Jews." So, you know, they see themselves as being in this epic battle against their arch enemies, and from their perspective, they're winning. You know, as they are arguably the one part of the axis of resistance who has been emerging reasonably victorious compared with the rest, right? Hamas and Hezbollah being severely weakened, and Iran not performing exactly stellar in its own offensive actions against Israel. Now, the reason, of course, for that is that they have a very soft target, right? International shipping is a very soft target compared with attacking Israel, for example, and it's very fickle. You know, the moment there is a risk of ships sinking, you know, basically the shipping industry responds the way it does. So long and the short of it is, you know, the Houthis themselves might well have an interest to keep the conflict boiling, maybe at a bit of a reduced rate, because it allows them to live up to their propaganda narrative of standing with the people of Palestine against their arch enemy. And more importantly, it allows them to, you know, downplay the economic challenges that people in Houthi-controlled Yemen face, the rising food prices, the lack of basic social services, salaries not being paid, because they can always say, oh, this is due to the war. And the war is reasonably popular in Yemen, and actually not even just in Houthi-controlled areas. I was in Aden at the beginning of the Houthi campaign, and what struck me is that despite the fact that the Adenese are not big fans of the Houthis in general, the attacks against Israel certainly are popular with taxi drivers and cafe owners and, you know, these kinds of people. So we need to keep this in mind. And then the other thing is, and that's the second part of the answer, of course, even if the Houthis would stop now, and they might well do, because I mean their arsenals are reduced, and they probably could do with some breathing space as well. What comes next, right? Unless something fundamentally changes, it's just a matter of time before the Houthis will again exploit a similar opportunity to make their presence known, whether this is against Western shipping or against other civilian targets as they did in the past. And our George's question is on Somalia is quite interesting. I don't think it's the Houthis who are arming the Al-Shabaab. It's likely that Al-Shabaab receives weapons from the same sources as the Houthis do. I mean, there's indeed a lot of evidence. But the question why European Union naval forces, Aspides and Atalanta, are not doing more in the enforcement of sanctions has arguably less to do with the lack of a UN mandate, because the UN mandate is already clear, right? In fact, any member state of the United Nations is not only allowed to inspect ships suspected of smuggling weapons, but they are mandated to, they have to conduct these inspections. The problem is more on the domestic front in Europe, I would argue, where Brussels and of course the member states of the European Union are very, very reluctant to commit to a more robust enforcement of sanctions. In the case of the Houthis, partially because they're afraid, right? If you wanted to effectively patrol the approaches to the ports, you would need to be very close to the ports, and even for a Western warship, that carries significant risks, right? So, I mean, you would need to be willing to accept a fair deal of risk if you want to do this effectively. Back to you.
Well, Christian, thanks very much for that. We have quite a few questions building up. One in particular from John Gambrell of the Associated Press, who has raised his hand. So I'm going to invite him to pose his questions directly now. John, over to you.
Yes, hi. Thank you very much for your time. Two questions. I know that you guys had spoken earlier about the slowdown in Houthi attacks. in the Red Sea, in the Gulf of Aden. Is this due, do you think, to the US and UK strikes? Is it a lack of armament from the Houthis, a slowdown in the traffic, bribes by shippers to the Houthis as suggested by UN experts, or something else? And given the fact that Trump will re-enter the White House next week, and it's likely he's going to reimpose that FTO designation on the Houthis, overall, what do you think the risk to the wider Yemen conflict that's been under this shaky ceasefire is? Do you think this is going to escalate to the point that we're going to see open warfare again? Thank you.
Thanks very much. There are a couple of questions in the chat with regards to Russia and this particular issue. One from Yulia Maltseva. How could Russia positively benefit from the crisis besides disruptions of global trade? A reference to the possible support for the Houthis, and in a similar vein, also from Michaela Matai, what is your assessment about Russian support to the Houthis, be it in the form of equipment, training, and intelligence? We've had a question also from Michael Hamnatan. Could you elaborate a bit more on the Djibouti arms smuggling route? What is the role of Djibouti in all of this? Olivia Rose Brady, how do the issues you mentioned today affect businesses in Europe? How do European businesses build resilience and the knock-on effects on Houthi activity in the Red Sea? I'm going to ask Wolf Christian and Fabian to perhaps kick off on John's questions, and maybe also the Djibouti question also. One or other of you possibly also the Russia issue. The European businesses question, I'm going to throw in the direction of Albert, but also talking about the issues of the new normal, as Wolf Christian raised, and the adaptation that shipping companies have made to this. How sustainable is that, do you think, particularly in terms of those actual pressure points of economic cost that are being suffered by the regional states more directly involved, the port authorities, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and so on and so forth? Is there a new normal? Is there a steady state that they could sustain? So first, I think to Wolf Christian, and then Fabian, and then perhaps Albert as well.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nick. On this question, I think it's probably a combination of several points. Your first question, why do we have this dip in attacks? It's partially that the attacks particularly on command and control infrastructure on the Houthi side seem to be having an effect. I mean, they've been steadily degrading the capability to launch. Of course, it's never entirely clear how effective individual attacks are, at least not people like us who work with open source information. But yes, that seems to be part of the answer, right? So they are starting to bite. Another part of the answer is that indeed, probably supplies are starting to run low, and we can see this from the shift away from the more sophisticated weapon systems like cruise missiles towards USVs and UAVs during the course of the campaign. I mean, that's a pretty strong indication that the stocks are running low. We don't really know anything about the rate of resupply. Like I said, there haven't been many seizures, surprisingly, during the last 14 months. I have great doubts about the bribes by shippers to the Houthis. I think John makes reference here to the last panel of experts report that came out late last year, and where it was famously stated, I think, that the Houthis make as much as $180 million in bribes, basic protection money from the Houthis. we really have questions on that number. Yes, it's likely that some shipping lines are paying something to someone. We're not even entirely sure whether it's the Houthis, but the amounts mentioned here are so high that they are almost certainly not grounded. In fact, I don't think we have time to really go into the empirical evidence for that. The Russia question I'd like to leave to Fabian, who I'm sure has views on it. So maybe very briefly on Djibouti. Djibouti is an interesting case. I mean, Djibouti has been mentioned in smuggling to the Houthis for many years now. As you probably know, John, this wasn't John's question. As you guys probably know, it's also basically the jumping off point for migrants going to from Africa to Yemen and then further on towards Saudi Arabia. So there has always been a lot of sort of dodgy dealings, particularly in that port of Abok. When I was still with a panel of experts until 2023, Djibouti was always one of those countries where you didn't really quite get much of a response when you were asking them for assistance with your investigation. So there's a fair bit of information about the people who are behind the smuggling in Djibouti, and the Djiboutian authorities have been constantly looking the other way. And in fact, even raising this issue with other nations never resulted in much, because basically, as you all know, many Western nations rely on Djibouti as the military base in the region. They don't really want to sour their relationships with the government of Djibouti, which, of course, is deeply corrupt. With that, I'd like to hand over to Fabian.
Thanks so much, Wolf Christian. Regarding the Russian angle, which is quite interesting. I mean, you had these statements by Putin saying because the West has supplied long-range attack weapons to Ukraine and allowed them to use these weapons against Russian positions, they could respond in kind by giving weapons to groups fighting the West. And then there have been, I think, credible Western press reports basically sourcing government officials saying that Russia might be considering supplying anti-ship cruise missiles to the Houthis. The system in question is the Bastion anti-ship missile complex using the Yahond or Nix missile. And these are very sophisticated systems, much more sophisticated than what the Houthis have, much bigger danger not only to cargo ships, but to Western ships operating in the region. So that would be a substantial escalation and would drive up the risk to Western navies operating in the area. Which is not to say that there's no risk right now. These are active war situations. There's a big chance the ship will be hit at one point if this campaign continues, but still it would be just another level of threat. But then again, there are tremendous challenges when it comes to supplying these missiles to the Houthis. You have to get the missiles into Yemen, you have to get the launchers into Yemen, the support equipment, the training, all of that is very complicated under the current situation, especially when you're facing massive Western intelligence efforts. Then there have been reports about Russian help with targeting, in particular the presence of Russian GRU, so military intelligence members on the ground in Yemen, as well as the provision of satellite data for targeting. Again, these are press reports that we cannot independently verify, but I think the possibility that Russia is at least considering supporting the Houthis in a more active role should be taken serious. But again, it's too early to make any confirmed statements about it.
Yep.
Thanks, Fabian. Yeah, Albert.
On European businesses and sustainability. So I think the impact on European businesses has been limited. There is a consumer price index, which is not specific for Europe, but global more generally. The rise in this consumer price index has been minimal during the past year, about 0.6%. And that's accounting for disruptions beyond the Red Sea. So Red Sea, Panama Canal disruptions. So you take the Red Sea disruption alone and its impact on the consumer price index, that seems to be quite limited. In terms of building resilience for European businesses, I mean, I think one option would be to reshore some manufacturing to either North Africa or Eastern Europe, but this would also come at a cost. And then addressing the point on sustainability of the status quo, I think globally the situation appears more or less sustainable. Now, the truth is that the current disruption is taking part of what used to be available fleet to cover for the delays, for the longer routes. So an additional disruption would magnify the impact of, the ongoing disruption would magnify the impact of other problems in the Panama Canal or in other straits. Now, specifically countries in the Red Sea, it really depends on which country when we're thinking about whether the situation is sustainable. Saudi Arabia seems to have weathered the crisis relatively well overall. Part of it is because most of its oil shipments go from the Gulf to Asia, so they don't take the Red Sea route. And the country has also found logistical arrangements to compensate for the declines of traffic through its Red Sea port. So, for example, Saudi authorities have diverted a lot of their traffic through King Abdulaziz port in Dammam in the Persian Gulf, which has been handling record amounts of cargo. Saudi has also been sending more crude oil exports through its northern Red Sea terminals. So they send the crude from the Persian Gulf to the terminal in the northern Red Sea, and it doesn't need to cross the Bab al-Mandeb Strait. For Saudi, one question is the viability of the several ports that have been inaugurated in recent years in the Red Sea coast, including the port in Jizan and King Abdullah port, as well as its various tourism initiatives in the northern Red Sea. That would also affect potentially Emirati companies that are investing in cruise terminals in the northern Red Sea. And then for Egypt, the situation is clearly critical, but Egypt got lucky last year as short-term relief came in the form of combined pledges from several funders, including the EU, the IMF, the World Bank, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the UK. Overall, over 60 billion US dollars were pledged for Egypt, which gives the country additional flexibility to deal with the loss of revenues. But it's unclear how much of those pledges will be eventually dispersed.
Albert, thanks very much. I'm going to abuse the privilege of the moderator with one question, picking up on the earlier theme about the extent to which the campaign may or may not be connected to of the possibility or otherwise of a Gaza ceasefire, and whether that will raise or lower the rheostat. Of course, the Houthis have had a very, very declaratory policy over the targeting of shipping with links to Israel. That's evolved over time, but there's been much debate around the extent to which the actual targeting has matched up to the declaratory policy. So I'd be interested in what the data on that is, and I think I'd throw that one to Edward. Also, there is a question from Lars Boje Madsen, who says he's had the honor of serving and working in Yemen for more than 16 years, including 6 years in the Yemen Coast Guard. Why has the international community been so passive when it comes to Yemen domestic political politics and the scene there? I think that's definitely one with Wolf Christian's name on it. There's a question from Louis Bern, essentially on the role of China. China is a lot of the energy exports out of the region are heading east now, and China is a major and critical importer of energy from that region, and yet the Chinese Navy is present, but has been conspicuously, shall we say, passive or absent during this crisis. And any thoughts on how you would account for that? So I think that'll do for this round. So first to Edward, and then to Wolf Christian again, and then Albert again.
Thank you very much for your question, Nick. So indeed, the Houthi attacks on ships have evolved through 5 different phases of escalation, although we refer to them as simply the phases of the Houthi campaign. These phases have either been directly announced or alluded to by the Houthis, and from the statements made, one is able to discern often through very obscure language. Firstly, the expanded targeting criteria, including the type of ships that would be targeted, and also the geographical scope within which the attacks are to take place. And secondly, at times, the immediate trigger behind each phase. So if we focus on the targeting criteria, we ultimately have all Israeli-owned ships passing through the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. We have all ships traveling to Israel. We have all ships providing protection to Israeli ships, all US and UK owned ships, all ships belonging to companies with other ships calling at Israeli ports, alongside threats made such ships in the Mediterranean Sea and Indian Ocean. So as you can see, this has been an evolving, overlapping, and complex targeting criteria, and it's therefore very difficult to assess the extent to which the Houthis have stayed true to it. What we can do, however, is examine the number of Houthi attacks on commercial ships by their country of ownership. I would say that that's very relevant here. So Greek-owned commercial ships were attacked significantly more than others, with a total of 59 attempted attacks. Cypriot, Singaporean, British, and US-owned commercial ships follow, each with a count in the range of 10 to 12 attempted attacks. So I would just add that on one hand, this would perhaps be expected. Greece is the largest ship-owning country, and there has also been increased defense industry cooperation between Greece and Israel in recent years. However, interestingly, these countries will participate in one or more of the 3 international missions. So thank you very much.
Thanks. Wolf Christian.
Yes, that's an excellent question by Mr. Madsen. I've actually also worked with the Yemeni Coast Guard after 2018, and I share your frustration, irritation about the lack of support. That's what I'm reading from your question for the sort of anti-Houthi forces in Yemen. I think part of the answer is that the international community doesn't really understand the domestic conflict in Yemen, and that conflict is very much discussed in propaganda terms, right? So I mean, the Saudis for the longest time spoke about this being a proxy war, and the Houthis basically being a puppet of Iran, which clearly doesn't do them justice. And the Houthis have been talking about basically all the anti-Houthi forces as mercenaries of the princes of the oil, basically saying, oh, these people have no agency of their own. The only reason they fight the Houthis is that they're being paid by the Saudis and the Emiratis, of course. And that's equally wrong, of course. I mean, the Houthis are a autonomous, legitimate, in a sense, political actor, and they represent a constituency, and they have very much a political project. But this is also true for a lot of the sort of anti-Houthi forces, right? I mean, the STC, the separatists in the south, but also the various other groups that make up the current presidential leadership council. But this narrative, this prevailing narrative that anti-Houthi forces are basically just the militias and the ploy of the Saudis and the Emiratis, is certainly part of the reason why there isn't more international support. And I mean, I've come across over the years quite a few discussions with policymakers in the West who says, well, all of these people are bad. They like equally bad, right? And I think that's not true. Obviously, the anti-Houthi camp is also not exactly dominated by democratic forces, but in terms of their human rights records, there are significant differences to what the Houthis do as opposed to their opponents. So yes, I agree. It would be desirable to support anti-Houthi military forces inside of Yemen to a greater extent than is being done, including by the West. And the reason I agree is that I believe that the only way we can come to a sustainable peace in Yemen, this would happen out of a position of strength. And at the moment, negotiations with the Houthis are out of a position of weakness. The Houthis are, like I said at the outset, from their own perspective, going from strength to strength. First, they beat the Saudis. Now they are resisting the Americans and the Israelis, showing their solidarity with Palestine. That's all great. And in that environment, they are very unlikely to agree to any serious peace agreement. And if we looked at what they've done in the past, they've basically rarely ever done what they promised to do, for example, as a result of the Stockholm Agreement. So I think the only way to negotiate towards a sustainable peace deal would be by strengthening the anti-Houthi coalition and, as a matter of fact, enforcing the sanctions regime. Over to Albert.
Thanks, Wolf. So on Chinese presence, I think that there's a few things to remember here. First, most of China, if not all of China's oil imports from the Arabian Peninsula do not cross the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. They come from the Persian Gulf. So they are unaffected by the disruption. Second, the PLA Navy has deployed vessels in the area, and they are escorting Chinese ships. They just haven't joined international coalitions. It's also important to remember that the conflict with the Houthis is diverting resources and attention from the US, potentially away from East Asia into that part of the world. And it's costly for the US Navy. It's also an opportunity for Chinese observers to gather intelligence. And from a Chinese perspective, would it really make a difference if, let's say, China joined Operation Prosperity Guardian? Would shipping come back? I'd say another factor is that there were reports, I don't know for sure if they're credible or not, that the Houthis told both China and Russia that their ships would not be targeted. And lastly, there's the optics factor. So joining some of these coalitions, Operation Prosperity Guardian or Poseidon Archer, would seem to large parts of the Arab public as joining an operation that is supportive of Israel's actions in Gaza. And clearly, China may want to avoid that. Over to you, Nick.
Albert, thanks very much. We're coming towards the end of our allotted time. There are a few questions still in the chat box. I don't think we're going to get to all of them, so my apologies, but we will just have one last round and a couple of questions really on the Western, particularly naval and maritime responses to this issue. One from Gonzalo Vasquez. What are the main insights and conclusions which can already be drawn from the performance of NATO navies in the region? Is there any particular lesson which the crisis could provide for the alliance's maritime strategy? I think I'd have a bit of view on that, but I will throw that to the panel. Secondly, from Peter Zhao in Rotterdam. And again, this is sort of an international, particularly European response, but from the commercial side, besides influence on freight and insurance rates, what other security measures can be taken by shipping industry to continue transiting the affected area? Reports of demand for increased private maritime security companies and videos of onboard guards, etc. So a couple of response questions there. And then finally, raising things back up to the more kind of strategic, diplomatic and political level. Kais Makhlouf, do you think the hammering, he puts it, attacks on Hezbollah and the fall of Assad will have an effect on Iran's policy with regards to the Houthis? Will Iran rely more on the Houthis? So how will that dynamic work? And will the Houthi Red Sea campaign be liable to be negotiated away in any potential talks between Iran and a potential, an approaching, looming Trump administration? Will there be a return to maximum pressure from the Trump administration? So I think probably Fabian, Wolf Christian, on the responses question, I'm happy to pitch in some thoughts also, but it's very much your show, guys. So Fabian, maybe over to you first.
Well, thanks so much for this last round of questions. Maybe I start with the question on whether Iran might rely more on the Houthis. I would say it's difficult because you could argue that the reason for the Houthis' continued success is the reason why they're not that great of a partner to begin with. That is geography, and that they are on the periphery of the axis of resistance. So when Iran, of course, you have ideological projects in the region, you have a geopolitical project, but you also have a core security project. And that core security project is basically ensuring regime survival. And in that project, Hezbollah and Lebanon basically acted as the forward defense, in quotation marks, of Iran. They could really build up deterrent capabilities by giving Hezbollah huge numbers of missiles. You just can't do that with the Houthis because they're so far away from Israel. They're relatively far away from the major American bases in the region. So they need long-range weaponry that is expensive, that is difficult to transport, that can be intercepted. The range difference between Yemen and Iran is almost non-existent when it comes to striking Israel. So I think they're a very nice tool to have for Iran, if you can consider them a tool. Probably that's not the right word. They might try to capitalize on the success of the Red Sea mission more, but will they ever be able to become even get close to replacement of Hezbollah? That's another question. The other problem, of course, is that Hezbollah was loyal to Iran. They subscribe to the Iranian ruling ideology. The Houthis don't do that. Now, what does it mean in practice? What kind of influence does Iran have over the Red Sea operations? We just don't know because we're not in the room when the decisions are made. So I think it's possible they will focus more on them, but I don't think they will ever get close to being a replacement for the kind of groups that Iran had in the Levant. And when it comes to lessons learned by Western navies, I mean, Nick Childs is really the person to ask here, but from what I've heard, is the big problem for European navies in this particular campaign is just the lack of missile defense capabilities. I mean, there have been instances where improvisation has worked against that threat, but you can't rely on that. So this is something they will have to focus on in the future. And then when you talk about UAVs, you have systems that can intercept them, but then again, that's not really the threat they have trained against. Extremely low flying, extremely slow UAVs. So again, here some changes have to happen. And of course, as has been widely reported, arsenal depth, that just using a lot of very expensive interceptors and relatively cheap systems becomes a problem in the near term.
Yeah, maybe following up, let's maybe start with the easier question, the one raised by Peter Zhao in Rotterdam regarding private maritime security companies. Private maritime security companies and in particularly armed guards on board of commercial ships have been a feature of those waters ever since the Somali piracy 10, 15 years ago. So basically at that time, it became standard practice to have a group of security guards on board of ships, both in the Red Sea and the large parts of the Gulf of Aden. So in a sense, that though is fairly costly. So you're looking at several thousands of dollars per day to have these crews on board. You also lose a little bit of time, but they go on board and then leave again. So when Somali piracy seemed to recede a couple of years ago, shipping companies were less inclined to take that expense, and so there was a bit of drop in that activity. And now with the Houthis starting the campaign, there's more demand again, and then piracy also going up. So in a sense, we're going back to where we were, I would say, 10 years ago in terms of that demand. Now, the difference, of course, between pirates and the Houthis is if you have a private security team, which is usually 4 to 5 people with automatic rifles on board, there are lots of Houthi threats you can't effectively defend against, right? I mean, obviously, you will have no impact on a missile. There's nothing you can do against a UAV. Even a slow-flying UAV cannot easily be shot down with an automatic rifle by a couple of security guards. So the only threat you can really defend against, and we've seen that a couple of times, is USV, basically drone boats. So there's been a few cases where armed security guards were able to take out USVs, precisely because, as Fabian says, they carry such a high payload. If you manage to basically hit the warhead, the threat goes away. But that is fairly risky business, of course. And then, of course, you can defend against sort of attacks from skiffs and such like, with the Houthis have also, in some cases, done, right? So Houthis have attacked ships also from skiffs in the past. So there isn't a hell of a lot you can do with private security guards. But yes, there's clearly a resurgence compared with previous years. I think Fabian has largely answered what I can say about sort of changes in naval strategy. I think the main differences between Europeans and the Americans within NATO, I think the US, for them, it's mostly an issue of resupply, right? So basically, a lot of very expensive interceptors have been used up in this campaign. Before the end of the year, there's talk about more than $1 billion in expenses for these Red Sea deployments for the US alone, or I think the US and the UK or something like that. So clearly it is both very expensive and interceptors are scarce. For the Europeans, I think the challenge is more risk-taking, basically, right? So a lot of continental European navies, at least, are very, very reluctant to engage in these kinetic operations, having learned now how risky they are for the crews and the ships. And as a result of that, I think the discussions about the renewal of a mandate for ASPIDES is going to be a very interesting one, because in some sense, ASPIDES has, of course, done a great job in protecting European shipping. But at the same time, they haven't really contributed much to the Houthi problem going away. And in order to do that, one would need to be willing to take more risks. And that in a situation where European naval assets are scarce to start with, there are lots of competing demands in the Baltic Sea and the North Sea, elsewhere. It will be really interesting to see how decision-making among EU member states regarding this region will go on in the future. And with that, I'd hand back to Nick, who has probably more views on naval strategy.
Thanks, Wolf Christian. And yes, just to really sort of endorse, but also amplify what both Fabian and Wolf Christian has been saying on at least the naval lessons out of this. Certainly for European NATO navies, well, for navies generally, I think there's been a very, very sharp learning curve in terms of learning tactical lessons and sharpening capabilities as a result of all of this. For European navies, I think it's shown up some capability shortfalls and gaps in capability and the level of capability of certain ships and the numbers of ships available that are suitable for such an operation, which they will have to take away. The American ships have clearly shown a more comprehensive capability, including in the anti-ship ballistic missile space. But even for the Americans, there are significant strategic issues, as Wolf Christian suggested, around very high weapons expenditures of expensive weapons. But it's not just a dollars and cents question. It's very much also a strategic stockpile question. Are the resources available to resupply these capabilities in short order for other strategic commitments? And so in the end, I think one of the lessons, including to deal with the complexity of different types of targets that Fabian mentioned, is all navies will start to look at doing things differently in future, finding new and more cost-effective ways of defending, whether that's new advanced gun systems or the mythical arrival of lasers to deal with some of these weapons. I think all that is going to be accelerated, and for all navies also, there is the lesson that these types of sustained operations are difficult to keep going for navies that are both already overcommitted, but also stretched very thin and with very constrained resources. So that is one of the pinch points in whether this is a steady state and new normal situation as far as the Red Sea is concerned. It's a bit invidious of me in a way to have ended up with the last word, but we are past our scheduled time. We've had a great discussion. Thanks to my colleagues for their insights, their presentations, but also their responses to the questions. Thanks to all of those who've been participating in the audience, particularly those who put questions. Very much appreciate it all. But with that, I think I will once again reinforce my appreciation, and I think I'm sure on behalf of the audience, their appreciation to my colleagues for their time and their thoughts, and bring proceedings now to a close. Thanks all very much.